Well, hello, boys and girls. Hope you're okay. Hope you're in the Christmas spirit and you're enjoying school and everything is going well. Look, I put my Christmas reindeer antlers on this morning. I'm getting into the Christmas spirit. I'm going to take those off though, and I'll tell you what I'm going to put on. I'm going to put on one of my favourite hats. I tend to wear this at Christmas sometimes. It's my sort of Christmas storytelling hat, so I thought I'd put that on today. Now, if you remember last week, I started to tell you the Christmas story, so I'm going to carry on with that today. But we're actually in December now, and we're in the season called Advent that the church has. And Advent is the season that runs right up to Christmas Eve, which is on the 24th of December. And as I mentioned, you get something special in Advent. And look, I got mine. Here it is. It's my Advent calendar. And I've started to open some of the doors. I don't know whether you've got Advent calendars at home. Maybe you've got one like this, or you might have one with a snowman on, or maybe if you're really lucky, you've got one of those Advent calendars where you open the door and you've got a piece of chocolate. Anyway, mine's just sort of a country scene as a country church, a bit like our church in Handley, and there's a deer and some snow and all sorts of things. So I'm getting in the Christmas spirit. So let's think back to our story. If you remember last week, I told you about the story of Christmas. It's a story we probably all know very well, but it's always worth retelling these stories. And that's what we do at Christmas. So what happened last week? Well, if you remember, it all starts with a young girl, a young woman called Mary. And you remember the angel came to her and told her that she was going to be a mum and she was going to have a very special child that was going to be called Jesus. And she was about to get married to Joseph, and Joseph wasn't sure what was going to happen, but an angel came to him, and then he thought that's great, and he got married to Mary. And then Mary went and saw her cousin Elizabeth, who was also going to have a baby. And that's where we sort of left them. So let me get up the pictures for this week's story so that we can see what is happening. There we go. Let me just put them right up nice and big on the screen for us. There we go. So this week we're going to look at the journey to Bethlehem, the journey to Bethlehem. So if you remember, Mary was expecting a baby, the baby Jesus, and she'd married Joseph. And if you remember, Joseph, can you remember what job Joseph did? What did Joseph do as a job? That's right, he was a carpenter. He was a carpenter. He works with wood and makes things out of wood. I know there's some carpenters in Handley, so maybe your dad or your mum work as carpenters in Handley, but he was a carpenter. Anyhow, if any of you have remembered your mum when maybe your brother or sister was born, you might remember that her tummy got bigger and bigger and bigger as the baby grew. And that's what was happening to Mary. It got to the point when her tummy was really, really big. And ladies, when that happens to them, they know that soon the baby's going to be born. And this is what Mary was realizing, that very, very soon she would be a mum. Like most mums, she was quite excited about this, but she was also a bit nervous of what it would be like to be a mum. Just think of all the things you have to do to be a mum. You have to look after the baby, you have to feed the baby, you have to change the baby's nappies if they're smelly, all those sorts of things. You've got to cuddle the baby, and when it's crying, you've got to make it happy. Oh gosh, it's a really important job being a mum. So Mary was thinking about all of these things. Now, a bit like in our time, sometimes things suddenly change that we really don't expect. And earlier this year, back in March, when we were sort of getting on with things, suddenly our lives have changed this year because of the virus that's around, and we've had to do things a bit differently. Well, back in Mary and Joseph's time, it wasn't a virus, but it was other things that had happened. And there was this man. He was the Emperor Augustus. Look at him in his uniform. Ooh, he looks a bit scary, doesn't he? Look at that stern face and his armour. He was in charge of the Roman empire. He was like the king, but they called them an emperor. And at that point, the Roman Empire was in control of most of the known world. And what's more, it was in control of the place that Mary and Joseph lived. Can you remember where Mary and Joseph lived? The town they lived in? It wasn't Bethlehem. That's where Jesus was born. But the town that Mary and Joseph lived in was a town called Nazareth, Now, this man, the Emperor Augustus, he liked to collect tax. And taxes are basically when you collect money from people who live in the countries that you're in charge of. And he liked to collect these taxes because it helped pay for his armies to invade other countries and to do all sorts of other things as well. But he wanted to know how many people lived in the towns and villages in the area where Mary and Joseph lived, in the nation of Israel as it was back then, Israel and Palestine. So he spoke to another one of his people, called a guy with a really odd name called Quirinius, and he was the governor of all Syria. And that meant that he was in charge of the area where Joseph and Mary lived. And what happened was they called a census. They said that every single grown-up person, they had to go back to the town where they were from, where they were born, and they had to sign a paper to say who they were and where they lived. And this meant that then the Emperor Augustus could send out his soldiers and people and everything and could collect the taxes. Now, guess where Joseph was from originally? Guess where he was born? We've mentioned it once, not Nazareth, but yes, Bethlehem. Joseph was from Bethlehem. And that's because his family line was the line of King David, who'd been one of the kings of Israel. Do you remember the story I told you in school about David and Goliath, where David fought the giant? Well, that's the David we're talking about. And the city of David is known as Bethlehem. So Mary and Joseph had to make their way to Bethlehem. And of course, in those days, you couldn't catch a train or a bus, or there weren't even cars. You had to walk. Well, thankfully, Joseph had a donkey. He used to use the donkey to help carry his wood and all the sorts of things that he needed to carry as a carpenter. Mary was very nervous about this. Let's not forget, she was about to be a mum. And sometimes if you talk to mums when they're about to have a baby, they don't want to be moved around or go on long journeys or anything like that because it's very, very tiring. But sadly, they had no choice. Joseph and Mary had to go to Bethlehem. So they got some things ready, and Joseph carefully helped Mary to get up on the donkey. And they started the long journey to Bethlehem. I wonder if you've been learning one of those Christmas songs or carols about Mary on the donkey. You know, little donkey, follow Mary. I'm sure you've been learning that at school. I love it when we can all get together and hear those songs. But Mary and Joseph, they set off. And it was quite a long and dangerous journey, and quite scary in places. They had to come through the mountains and valleys. And Mary, oh gosh, she wasn't feeling great. But they had to keep going, and the donkey had to keep walking. Eventually, after what seemed like a journey that would never ever end, finally in the distance, they could see Bethlehem. Mary felt greatly relieved. However, as they got closer and closer to Bethlehem, they realised it was really, really busy. As they got on the road near to Bethlehem, they saw more and more and more people heading into the town. Suddenly, it dawned on Joseph that he might really struggle to find a place for them to stay. I mean, let's remember, in those days, they didn't have a telephone, they didn't have the internet or anything like that. You couldn't book a hotel in advance. You had to turn up and hope that there might be a room available. Well, when they got into Bethlehem, it was heaving. People everywhere, horses, donkeys, carriages, so many people. They hadn't seen so many people for such a long time. And there they were, all in Bethlehem. Mary started to become quite worried, and she started to say to Joseph, you know, Joseph, I think I might be having this baby. I think I might have the baby anytime soon. We've really got to find a place to stay. Joseph was worried too. So they started to go into the town and they started knocking on the doors of inns to see if they could find a place. But there was no room. They went from door to door and they asked innkeepers, have you got anywhere for us to stay? And the innkeepers saying, sorry, no. The place is full, it's full. We've got so many people here in Bethlehem. They've all had to come because of the census. Joseph kept trying until it got really quite late at night. But no joy. There was no room at the inn. But eventually they knocked on the door of one innkeeper, and the innkeeper opened the door and he said, look, I am really sorry, we're absolutely full. Every room has got people in it. We can't fit any more people in the inn. Joseph said to the innkeeper, look at my wife Mary, she's about to have a baby. We've got to find somewhere to stay. The innkeeper rubbed his beard and thought to himself, I really must try and help this people. Then he said to himself, I know if you go round the back of the inn, just by the hillside there, we have a cave that we use as a stable, as a barn. There are some animals in it, but there's lots of straw and it's warm and it's dry. Maybe you should go there, at least for tonight. So that's what Mary and Joseph did. They went round the back and they found this cave, and there was a manger for feeding the animals, and there were sort of sheep and other animals in the stable, in the cave. And just like the innkeeper said, it was actually quite warm. They were able to light a fire and they got plenty of straw. And of course, you know, Joseph had brought with him some blankets and rugs, and they made themselves as comfy as possible. In the background, they could hear the sheep going, meh, meh, and they could hear the cows bleating, but it was all right. But then suddenly Mary felt a kick in her tummy, and then another one, and then another one. And she turned to Joseph and she said, Joseph, I think I'm about to have the baby. Well, we'll leave the story there and we'll come back to it, but not next week. I'm going to tell you a different story next week, and that is the story that's going to involve some gold coins and chocolate, and we'll come back to the story of Mary and Joseph before the end of term. Anyhow, I hope you like that story. Let's go back to me on the screen again. Here we go. I hope you enjoyed that story, and I hope you have a really good week, and I hope you're getting excited about Christmas. Let's just say a little Christmas prayer. Heavenly Father, as we get ready for Christmas and all the excitement, we pray for our family and friends and the village and communities in which we live. Even though we're not going to be able to celebrate Christmas in the same way as we have done before, help us to find that sense of joy and happiness in all that we do. And we give thanks for the baby Jesus and for Mary and Joseph. Amen. So thanks for listening to me today. I hope you're really well, and I'll be back next week with another story. I might even have a different hat for you next week. But for now, bye-bye.